Oh,
Well, hello.
oh hello. Just topped off my drink.
Rearranging the bottle shelf there,
Already.
Dude, we have surprisingly, we met and we talked yesterday or 2 days ago, and just in that time, we have a lot more to talk about. I have all kinds of fun little updates for you.
Right.
I haven't seen you or talked to you in forever, but again, it's only been 24 hours, so
Actually, less than that. You
that's
called me earlier
well.
this week.
And I will tell you, look, I know Monday's episode was a little long, but I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah.
I still just enjoyed the ever living hell out of that.
Mm-hmm. Uncle Chaz, man. I mean, he made our lives so easy on that episode.
Yeah, and me too. Like, the idea of doing a history podcast about a movie.
Yeah.
Kind of like, I don't know. But to sit down and really talk about the refugee, the immigrant experience in the filming of Casablanca, which I don't know when the episode will air compared to when this one will air. But if you haven't listened to that one, you need to.
Yeah. I mean, Fighting on Film does it. Right. They do a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, I think so.
That was kind of a first for us. And I don't think we could have had anybody better to talk ad nauseum about Casablanca than Chaz Mena.
I mean, it helps that it's my favorite movie.
Yeah, that helps.
So the other thing I wanted to tell you about was I got some mail yesterday.
Oh.
I have been waiting. Some listeners and viewers may know this. I have been waiting for an inordinate period of time, thanks to the United States Postal Service, for some service records to come from a researcher in St. Louis at the National Archives. Norm Richards is my man. I got the connection through John McManus, so shout out to John and to Kevin for that hookup. But I'm holding now, for the first time, the service records of the Stevenson father and son from the Columbia Race Riot project. So I have finally got these in hand, and I didn't know that official government documents could be this exciting. I made it about 8 pages in, and I was like, oh my God, this changes everything. This is amazing. So I'm excited to get back to finishing the Second World War chapter of that. And, since we're just talking about things going on in my life, this will show you the kind of depravity. So I started building something.
I see.
It's 181 Field Hospital in Arnhem, because why not? So working on that as we speak, and a big shout out to friend of the show, podcast listener, and just all around great mate and beautiful, talented sculptor, Paul Hicks. Paul has been a longtime listener and viewer, so always good to see some of his work. Those are his airborne Arnhem heroes, figures from Empress Miniatures. But we're not here to talk about Arnhem. Well,
surprisingly,
it could happen. We're not here to talk about. We are actually here to talk about airborne operations, because there's a little bit of that factors into this. But we have a special guest today. Joining us is Mike Bechthold, who holds a PhD in history from the University of New South Wales in Canberra, Australia. Mike is an author and editor of 8 different books and several articles. A lot of his research has to do with air power and the air war, but the reason we have him on today is to talk about Canada at war, and Canada at war in the Second World War. So we're going to bring Mike on here, and there he is. He has appeared.
Hey guys, thanks for having me here. I'm really pleased. I've been a longtime listener of your show, a big fan, and it's wonderful to be here in person with you today.
It is always great to hear that, Bo.
It really is. It's so weird, because it's like we have fans, we have people that listen to us talk. Like we literally just doing this, in the height of COVID to fill the gap, So it's good to hear that.
Well, it's been through COVID, I mean, you know what COVID was like, and I discovered all sorts of great podcasts, and yours was one of them. And I mean, I think it's the boohickey history that really got me. It's like there's always shit history out there, and got to be called out. So good on you guys for doing that.
Look at that, Bo. Your segment is now internationally renowned.
I hope
you
so.
Did it. You did it. You've broken through the final barrier.
You lucky bastard.
Look at you. So Mike, let's kind of dive in. Let's not beat around the bush on this, and we'll have a bit of a commercial break here in a couple minutes, but not to worry. Let's talk a bit about overall big general picture of Canada's role in the Second World War, because it's not as though Canada enters the war completely on its own. It is kind of considered part of, Al Murray and James Holland have called it Duke, right? Dominion, UK, and Empire, and plus, right? Duke plus. So how does Canada fit into that picture, and how does Canada really come to evolve on the stage during the Second World War?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we can look back to the First World War, and Canada had a big role on the Western Front. 600,000 troops, almost 60,000 war dead. And Canada made a name for itself there, but Canada was still part of the British Empire at that point. So when Britain declared war in 1914, Canada was automatically at war at that point. By 1939, however, that had completely changed. The Treaty of Westminster had brought our sovereignty home, and Canada had to make its own decision to join the war. So on the 3rd of September, when Britain declared war against Germany, Canada wasn't automatically at war. Our parliament met, and a week later, Canada declared war and joined the war on its own accord. We didn't have to, but Canada looks overseas. I mean, our people are of French and British stock, and what happens in Europe is really important to us. And we knew that this was a crusade against evil, so Canadians volunteered to go. And I think that's a really important point. What are the numbers? Population was about 1.5 million in 1941. Over 1 million Canadians put on uniforms, both men and women, during the course of the war. And the vast majority of them were volunteers. We can talk a little bit later about conscription or the draft, as you call it. But only a very small number of Canadians that got into combat were drafted. The vast majority were volunteers. They saw what was going on overseas. They knew this was terrible, and they were willing to put their lives on hold and possibly give the greatest sacrifice possible to make things right. And large numbers of Canadians did that.
That's incredibly interesting that, Canada, they, like you said, when Britain declares war, Canada's not immediately drawn into the conflict. And that's incredibly interesting to me because, they're Canada's southern neighbors. The United States is still, debating this idea between intervention and isolationism. And you have FDR, who's campaigning in the election of 1940, that, we are not going to get into this conflict. That's Europe's problem, Europe's war. And obviously that all changes for the United States in December of 1941. But, so Mike, can you kind of tell our listeners a little bit, Canada's role in the early years of the Second World War?
Yeah, for sure. I think all of your listeners have heard about the Britain alone. I mean, that period when France has fallen, May, June 1940, and all of a sudden it's Britain standing alone against Hitler's Nazi Germany. And I think that's a little bit disingenuous. And I think a lot of British historians have recognized that, but it's still something that's held pretty closely. Yes, Britain was alone, but I'll use air quotes on that because it was the British Commonwealth. And the British Commonwealth was a pretty massive, powerful organization. As Duke alludes to, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's South Africa, it's India, and there's a lot of personnel there. There's a lot of industrial capacity, and Canada was a big part of that. And so it was Britain and the Commonwealth countries alone against Germany, which is very much different than Britain alone. So I think that's a big part of it. Canada mobilized right away. We sent a division over to England in 1939 and sent a second one by 1940. but it took a long time for Canada to get into combat. A lot of the time, we actually sent a brigade over to France that was there before the fall in June, but never got into any combat, and ended up evacuating not from Dunkirk, but from further south, Cherbourg, and I think Brest, and losing a lot of their artillery and trucks and so forth. But made all the people made it back to England. The first time Canadians were in combat was in major combat was not in Europe at all, but in the Pacific. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, we sent a brigade, 2 divisions, and two regiments and a brigade headquarters to Hong Kong, as sort of a signal to the Japanese of, hey, don't mess with the British Empire there. Well, we all know how that went. Every single one of the Canadians that went to Hong Kong were either killed or captured and spent the rest of the war in prison camp. But that was sort of the first big combat that the Canadians had. Canadian Sergeant Major Osborne was awarded the Victoria Cross for what he was doing. And in fact, the brigade commander was killed fighting the Japanese right outside his headquarters. The battle came to his headquarters, and he went outside to defend it and was killed in the process. So you can't say that there weren't brave acts taking place. The first real major combat for the Canadians in Northwest Europe was, of course, at Dieppe, the infamous raid in August 1942. David O'Keefe has done a fantastic job of giving us a new idea. Are you familiar with his work? So David O'Keefe has shown that perhaps one of the main reasons for attacking Dieppe was to capture an Enigma, 4-rotor Enigma machine, and that was a big motivation for the thing. As we all know, it failed. Of the 5,000 Canadians that went ashore, almost a little less than 900 ended up dying that day. Another 2,500 went into prisoner of war camps and were lost for the rest of the war. And it was a big disaster. There's no other way to call it. A lot of people look at it and say, oh, well, this is the British. They sent the Canadians to do what they wouldn't commit their own troops to do. And I think that's balderdash. That's boohickey history, if you want to term it that. The Canadians were demanding to be used at that point in the war. They'd been in England for the better part of 3 years doing nothing, and they wanted to get into the fight. And so everyone from the commanders on down, the Prime Minister Mackenzie King, wanted the Canadians in the fight, and we're quite happy to go to Dieppe. Wished it had gone better, but that's what happened.
It does seem like Dieppe kind of gets the either you believe in Dieppe in one of two ways, right? It's either it was a terrible, awful slaughter that did nothing, or it was a terrible, awful slaughter that showed the Allies what they had to do to nail amphibious assaults. And neither of those really hold a bucket of water at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot that's been written on D-Day and Dieppe, trying to link the two operations. This went wrong at Dieppe, and it was fixed for D-Day. So some people try to draw a straight line between those failures in 42 and the later successes in 44. And on the surface, it makes sense. I mean, the use of heavy bombers, the lack of cruisers and battleships providing preparatory fire, armored vehicles on the beaches, things like that, better signals. Definitely these things failed at Dieppe and were fixed by D-Day. But the thing is, there was 2 whole years in between those two operations.
Right.
And consider all of the other amphibious operations that took place. Torch, Husky, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, not to mention everything that's going on in the Pacific. So there's connections there, but they're not straight lines, and it wasn't a if-then kind of proposition. So yes, things were learned at Dieppe. Perhaps they should have been known before, but they were certainly reinforced in its failure. But D-Day didn't succeed because Dieppe failed. That's kind of balderdash.
Yeah, and I was actually reading up a little bit about the raid at Dieppe, and I actually learned that there's, funnily enough, a Louisiana connection to the raid at Dieppe. I learned, and this is something I didn't know beforehand, but the first American that was killed in action by German forces on the ground was a U.S. Army Ranger by the name of Lieutenant Edward Lustaloo, and he was from Franklin, Louisiana. There were about 50 Army Rangers or so that were attached to Canadian units, and he was one of the first to die on the American side anyway. So it's kind of unique to make that connection. Louisianian.
There's a bunch of good American connections to Dieppe. The B-17s of 8th Air Force had just arrived in England at this point, and were beginning to mount raids over the continent. On the 19th of August, 1942, B-17s were a key part of the air power being used to support Dieppe, and they were sent to attack a number of German air bases. The British were very fearful that those daylight bombers were going to get slaughtered, so they tasked their best fighter squadrons to protect them. And at the time, it happened to be 4 or 6 RCAF squadrons flying the latest mark of the Spitfire, because we're not going to lose our Americans now. We need to keep them safe and in the fight, so to speak. And like you mentioned, there were about 50 U.S. Army Rangers that took place in it, with both Canadian and British commando units, and 3 of them were killed on that day. And I don't know if you have it easily accessible, but the photo of Dieppe that I showed you is a really interesting photo from that perspective. It's one of the most famous images that we see of the devastation on the main beach at Dieppe. There it is there. You can see a burning landing craft in the back. You can see 2 of the Churchill tanks that landed on the beaches. And if you look at the 2 soldiers lying there, the soldier in the foreground is a Canadian soldier. But if you look at the guy in behind, you can see that he's got, I don't know what they're called, the puttees or things on
leggings,
his leggings over his boots. That's one of the American Rangers, one of the 3 Americans killed on the 19th of August.
Wow.
He just happens to be laying there. And this is a photo that was taken by the Germans shortly after the battle had concluded.
I'm going to just put another picture in right here just because of the flashes are helpful. But while we're talking a little bit, and we took our Dieppe detour, we did that thing where we started on a topic and then ran with it.
What we do.
One thing that's really interesting about the entry of Canada into the war and the U.S.'s continued isolation is that the volunteers that come out of the U.S. that say, you know what, I want to go fight. I want to go fight now. There's this little, you could almost think of it like a rat line out of the U.S. and into Canada, and from Canada into the RAF squadrons. So many of those guys that end up flying with the RAF in the Battle of Britain, who were Americans, come in or through a Canadian training squadron. They get their hours in Canada. They fly in Canada, and then they come over. And we could talk a lot about U.S. involvement, but that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about Canadians, by God. So they're, on the surface, they feel very, very similar to a normal British army, right? And readers of John Buckley's book, Monty's Men, will know what I mean, and that they wear a very similar uniform. They carry very similar equipment. They have a very similar regimental and battalion size breakdown, and things generally kind of look and feel like the British Army. But they operate under the British Army, but they operate on a different level as their own, almost as an independent branch within this umbrella. You want to talk at all about that?
Yeah, absolutely. 100% Canadian forces were integrated into the British Army or the Royal Air Force. We weren't independent. It wasn't like we were Canadian troops under our own direct command. We were Canadian troops serving under British command. Right. That being said, it was clear that we were Canadian troops, that they had reference to the government in Canada. And if at any time something was said that they didn't want to do or wasn't right, then the Canadian commander, whether it be Harry Crerar, who was the commander of 1st Canadian Army through the entire campaign, or someone else, had the right to say, sort of pull that national command authority card and said, respectfully, sir, respectfully, Montgomery, we're not going to do that. And Crerar didn't have to play that card very often, but he always knew he had it in his back pocket, as did Montgomery. I think the one time it actually came up had to do with Dieppe in 1944, when The Battle of Normandy was over. The pursuit up into the Channel ports and ultimately into the Scheldt was taking place. And the Canadian 2nd Division, who had landed at Dieppe in 1942, had been tasked to liberate it in September 1944. They accomplished this, and there was going to be a series of ceremonies in the city to honor the sacrifice of the Canadians 2 years earlier. And Crerar, as the senior Canadian commander, said, "I need to be there with my boys for this," and he went there. And Montgomery lost his shit about it because he was having a command conference and said, "Curry, you're not doing that. You're going to get your arse up to my command meeting, and your presence there is not. We're not arguing about it. You're coming here." And Crerar said, respectfully so, or "No, I'm going. And if you want to refer this up to higher levels, I'm happy to do that." And Montgomery said, "Oh, no, you're right. We'll just carry on." And
a rare moment of Monty not wanting to rock the boat.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we all know who Monty is. Monty, I think, is one of these great figures in history. Absolutely a great general, a great commander, did great things, but he was flawed. He wasn't a people person. He wasn't going to command by his charisma. He was going to command by his ability to get stuff done. And people followed him in spite of the fact that he was a cranky, onerous type of commander. So, yeah.
Gee, Bo, I can't imagine why I like him.
No reason.
Like a similarity study or something.
Yeah, I am just a loss for words for why. So, Mike, we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but Canada at Dunkirk. Obviously, Dunkirk is, this is a daring rescue mission because in its originality, you've got Churchill and his war cabinet that are like, well, I think this would be a success if we save 30,000 men. And all of a sudden, in this daring escape, we're able to save over 300,000. So what's Canada's, role in this? Because, we're always talking about the British, when it comes to Dunkirk. Very few people, maybe know that Canadian forces are at Dunkirk, or even the Belgians for that matter.
You have to throw a little caveat in there too. Don't forget about the French that get sacrificed so that the British can get away.
Exactly. So what is Canada's role in Dunkirk?
Yeah, the Canadians weren't really at Dunkirk in large numbers. The Canadians that had been committed to France evacuated further south, like from Cherbourg and Brest, I believe. So there weren't formed bodies of Canadian troops there. I think there were Royal Canadian Navy units in the English Channel that were helping to secure the convoys. But probably the biggest Canadian impact, and his name is slipping me right now, was the commander on the dock that was controlling all the ships coming in and the men going out. He was not named in the famous Dunkirk movie from a few years ago, but the main character was definitely based on his actions on the groin. And he was really a key figure in making sure that things were organized and didn't devolve into chaos, so that it was an organized shuttle of men onto the boats and away from the shores like that. And this, I can't remember his name right now. It starts with a C. Anyway, it'll come to me later. He ended up dying. He took one of the last boats out, and I think it was strafed by the Luftwaffe, and he ended up drowning or something like that. But it was like a really quite remarkable story.
Yeah.
So we see the evacuation from France, and then there's the struggle through North Africa and through the Mediterranean, and Canadians obviously involved in the Mediterranean campaigns up through Italy, and then the reentry into Northwest Europe, which is really kind of where we wanted to shift in this episode, focus a little bit on the Normandy campaign, but then take us through, September and into December of 1944, where the Canadians and Canadian Army is. And I think one of the things that fascinates me about this is when you watch the anniversary coverage, or you're flipping through the latest and greatest YouTube history sensation, or Netflix has yet another in a series of B-roll footage thrown together with talking heads. When they talk about D-Day, in the popular narrative, it's Americans and it's British, and that's really it. And generally in the U.S., it's just Americans. Everybody else is kind of at a loss. Oh yeah, there's some other beaches, Sword and Gold down that way, but really everything's at Omaha Beach, and everything's the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, and nothing else really matters. And maybe it's the paratrooper hanging from St. Mary Glees, which didn't happen. Thanks, Marty, or whatever have you. Nobody ever talked about what's happening on the other beaches, Gold and Sword. But then there's Juneau, which becomes a totally other kind of an anomaly all by itself. So let's talk maybe build up and what happens once they get there.
Yeah, if you don't know Mark Milner's work, I'm going to give it a little plug here. But Mark is one of the best Canadian historians writing on Normandy right now. His book "Stopping the Panzers" is absolutely essential reading to understand the Canadians' role in Normandy. And he's got a new book coming out, I think, in April on the Normandy campaign. And it's really interesting because if you read the title and read the publisher's blurb on it, it doesn't mention Canada at all. But it's kind of a guerrilla history of the Canadians in Normandy, where Mark is sort of telling this big overall story of Normandy and putting the Canadians right in the center of it. So I think it's going to be a really essential book to come out, and I'm really looking forward to reading it.
You're right on the money with Mike's books, because I've got the Stopping the Panzers. It's granted it's in the storage unit, but it's great because what it helps you do is place, here's everything that the Germans have to throw at the Allies in Hitler's, attempt to throw the Allies back into the beaches and back into the Channel. And here's what a band of Allied troops, primarily Canadians, have done to basically just grind them down and destroy whole units. I mean, you think about Panzermeer and even 12th SS, just watched their numbers completely dwindle in the face of really can we call them unsung heroes, Bo? Is that too cliche? Unrecognized, maybe?
Well, maybe by,
overlooked,
Americans, perhaps.
Modest.
Overlooked.
Yeah.
And overlooked.
Yeah, this is a big thing for me because I think Canadian historians in general have been far too reticent about blowing our own horn over the years. I think it's been better in later years. More recently, Mark Milner, Terry Kopp, Jack Granitstein, and some others have done a good job of showing what the Canadians actually accomplished in Normandy. But for far too long, we sort of downplayed our role. Even the official history, the Victory Campaign by C.P. Stacey, was more interested in talking about our foibles, our failures, than in our successes. Jack English, who's written a fantastic book on the Canadians in Normandy, that originally came out, I think the main title was The Canadians in Normandy, Failure in High Command. And then it was re-released with the main title, Failure in High Command, The Canadians in Normandy, that really looked at those issues with it kind of not seeing the forest for the trees. I mean, the fact is the Canadians were some of the most effective troops in Normandy, right from the 6th of June when they landed on the beaches at Bernier, Courseulles, and Saint-Aubin, and got further inland than any other Allied troops by the end of that first day of combat. Right through the battles at Bretteville, Norrie, and Puteaux, where they stopped 12th SS cold in a series of counterattacks. Then through the battles to capture Caen, and then all those big battles south of Caen, operations Totalize and Tractable, and then on to the Falaise Gap and the closing of that. And the Canadians were right there. Second and third division that landed on D-Day, and second division, which came in a month later, had some of the most days in combat of any Allied units during the entire Normandy campaign. Basically, the Canadians were sent into combat and they stayed in combat, whereas the Americans and the British had more troops and a little more latitude to move forces in and out of combat, to bring them back and give them a bit of a rest, time to recuperate and regenerate before throwing them back into the cauldron. whereas the Canadians, once they were committed to the battle, seemed to stay there much longer, and as a result, proportionately took as high casualties as any unit that was any formation that was fighting in Normandy.
Mhm.
I was going to ask you. I was like, so what exactly are the Canadians facing on Juno Beach? What is their resistance, casualty rates? I mean, because this is definitely worth bringing up.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really key question, because as you mentioned, the focus is always on Omaha, bloody Omaha, where the 1st and 29th divisions got very roughly treated by the Germans. I would say that, it's really tough to do the numbers because we don't have a really accurate number of American casualties at Omaha, nor do we have a really clear casualty count for the Canadians on Juno. I can tell you that 359 Canadian soldiers were killed on D-Day. 340 of them landed on Juno. The others were members of 1st Canadian Para Battalion that parachuted in with 6th Airborne. But I can't tell you how many died on the beaches. That's a 24-hour toll. So it includes those who died in the landings, those who died securing the beach hold, but also then the fighting for the rest of the day. So we don't have a sense of how many died sort of getting ashore and staying ashore. But I would argue that the fighting on Juno Beach was every bit as intense as anything that happened at Omaha. I mean, of course, Ulster had 2 German strong points on each side of the Soule River that were mounted around concrete bunkers with 88 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 75 millimeter guns. There was copious amounts of barbed wire and mines and mortars and machine guns and lots of artillery that were dropping their stuff on the Canadians as they came ashore. So it was a nasty fight. There was no point where there was a consideration of having to lift the division off the beach as was contemplated at Omaha, but it was nasty fighting. The Queen's Own Rifles, which landed at Bernier, took the highest casualties of any Canadian regiment that landed on D-Day, and they had a tough job. Their landing craft came down in front of the strong point instead of on either side of it because of the way the tides drifted. And one of the company's sergeant majors, a guy named Charlie Martin, has this really remarkable description of what it was like to land in the first wave. And I think we've all grown up on Saving Private Ryan, and we know that opening scene and the chaos and the quantity of everything that landed there. Charlie Martin's D-Day was a very different experience. He said that all of the Canadian landing craft were spaced out about 100 yards apart. So that meant that he could just see each one about 100 yards to his left and 100 yards to his right. And when the landing craft touched down and the bow went down, he said that it seemed like it was him and his 30 pals storming Nazi Germany all by themselves, that it was a very lonely experience. It wasn't this mass chaos, and that until much later, they weren't seeing a lot of other people around, and so they had to go on and get their job done and storm those defenses and capture their objectives and make it work. So very different. I love that when Saving Private Ryan first came out, there was a Canadian newspaper article, and I think this really captures what I was saying about Canadians not telling our own story very well. He said that if Saving Private Ryan had been a Canadian story, the Private Ryan would have been killed on the shore. The landing craft would have been sunk. His men would have been squished by a Tiger tank, and every single one of the rescue crew would have been killed. And sadly, I think that's pretty accurate.
I don't know. I mean, it's not funny.
No, it absolutely is funny.
But it is. It is. And that's, I don't know. Why do you think that is? That's sort of the self-deprecation there.
I think it's part of Canadian nature in general. George Stanley, who was one of our first military historians, wrote a book in the 1950s, and he called it A Military History of an Unmilitary People. And I think that's a very fair description of who we are. We're not a martial nation. We're not going out and conquering other countries. We'll go to war and we'll do a really good job of it when it's needed, but we're going to help others. We're not going to build a Canadian empire or conquer for the sake of conquer. We sort of answer the call when the call is made for generally very good reasons. I mean, there's this image of Canadians as peacekeepers. I don't know if you see that in the US, but one of our own big images of Canadians is of that blue helmeted peacekeeper during the Cold War. That were sent to keep the warring parties apart and to stop war, not to make war, so to speak. So it's part of our makeup. But I mean, the Canadian story in Normandy is one to be proud of, one to be celebrated. One of the great stories that I've written about has to do with the stand of this 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade on the 7th to the 10th of June, right after D-Day. Mark Milner's book makes really clear that Canadian 3rd Division, when they came ashore on D-Day, was seen as, in many cases, the fire brigade for the entire Allied landings, because planners beforehand had done a map recce of Normandy. They'd looked at the terrain, they'd look at German abilities, and they thought that if the Germans are going to launch a major armored counterattack, there's only one place they can do it, and that was to the west of Caen, right up through what became the Canadian sector. So the Canadians were sent in loaded for bear. They had extra artillery units, they had extra anti-tank units, they had lots of resources to prepare them to be tank killers. And that's exactly what 7th Brigade did over a 3-day span when 12th SS was launched at them, and in a series of really quite disjointed counterattacks, every single one of them was defeated in detail by the Canadians, to the point where the Germans had to sort of go running away with their tail between their legs because they couldn't get done what they were expecting to do. There's a great quote from, you mentioned Panzermeier earlier, Kurt Meyer. He said when he first saw the landings, "Oh, we're going to throw those little fish back into the sea." Well, it turns out those little fish had some pretty damn big teeth.
In there's a lot of tragic moments in the Normandy campaign, right? You think about the massacre at Ordor-Saint-Glen, right, which is immortalized forever by Laurence Olivier's introduction to World at War. But there's an equally, I think, disturbing atrocity that takes place regarding Canadian prisoners of war, and it is 12th SS.
It is, yeah.
And that episode where these men are they're shot dead and then they're run over by tanks, and all that does, I mean, in my reading, and my reading is based off of Tim Cook's 2-volume kind of look at it, but it seems as though all it does is increase the kind of fire in the belly of the Canadian soldier to say, you know what, fine, if you're going to do that, then we'll fight harder, we'll fight more ruthlessly, and don't even bother trying to surrender, because we'll finish this thing with the kid gloves off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure your listeners are quite familiar with the Malbany massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, where lots of American troops were executed, but in one case they were put in a field and trucks backed up, and they threw the tailgate open and machine guns were there, and they gunned them where they stood. Well, that's the exact thing that was happening to Canadians by 12th SS in Normandy. As early as the 7th of June, there was a pitched battle between the Canadians and 12th SS. And a lot of histories will say that the Germans won the day because they ended up holding the battlefield at the end of the day. But if you look at the battle in detail, it's quite clear that it was no better than a draw, and the Germans took losses that were as heavy as anything the Canadians took. But at one point during the battle, the Germans were taking Canadian prisoners, putting them in the middle of the road and running them over with their tanks. They were executing them rather than helping wounded soldiers. And what was even worse, there was large numbers of Canadian soldiers that were disarmed, walked behind the front, interrogated, and then executed. Probably the most famous incident happened in the Abbaye d'Ardenne, which is an old church that is still there, and you can visit the garden today and see where the Canadians were executed. There's a plaque on the wall with it's 18 or 20 photographs of the men that were murdered. In total, the 12th SS killed 152 Canadians in Normandy. Like that's an absolute massive war crime. Kurt Meyer was tried for these crimes, the only German that was tried by the Canadians. He was found guilty and he was ordered to be executed. at some point, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. Spent a big portion of it, well, a few years anyway, in New Brunswick in Canada. Was subsequently, during sort of the rapprochement in the 1950s, sent back to prison in Germany, where he was subsequently released. And sort of as an ironic footnote to the story, he ended up becoming a beer and liquor distributor, and ended up serving the Canadians who were based in Germany during the Cold War, which is really more than a little ironic.
Just a little bit.
That story about Ave Dardenne, it stands out. Bo, I think I told you about this. Listeners and viewers will know I'm a miniature war gamer, and I had been doing. I had set up a game at a local store before I moved back, actually, and this guy comes and he says, "Who are the forces?" And I said, "Well, I've got, 7th Canadians, and I've got some armor here, but the Germans will be 12th SS." And he goes, "Oh, I want to play those guys." And I'm always a little suspicious when someone gets excited about playing SS. It's reenacting SS, anything. It just makes me uncomfortable. Instantly, the red flags go up.
Yeah.
We started playing whatever, and I'm rolling dice, and he goes, these guys were really brave, and I was like, oh yeah, And he goes, they're the only SS unit that was cleared of all their war crimes. I was like, that is just patently false.
Bullshit.
That's just nonsense.
Getting over a cough.
And we went down the rabbit hole, and he packed up and he left. But I just, anyways, I think on that note, let's do a quick little commercial break, and we'll come back and we'll continue the campaign for Northwest Europe alongside our Canadian allies. Bo, how's that sound? Works?
That sounds good.
Good. All right. You want to support us? Go to our Buy Me a Coffee page and help us out. Drop down into the show notes or into the description, and you will see there how you can become a member and subscribe. For $5 a month, you get monthly kind of articles and live streams. You'll get bonus episodes, exclusive sneak peeks, all kinds of great stuff there. So be sure to go down to the Buy Me a Coffee page. While you're at it, you notice that logo down there right below Bo. That is the official Homebrew History logo designed by the bearded historian himself, Jeff Williams. Jeff is partnered with us permanently, I guess, as our illustrator. So be sure to check out Jeff's designs and check out his Etsy page down there. Go ahead and give him a follow. Homebrew History, as you may have picked up, is airing weekly. We are back on the airwaves celebrating with you, bringing in guests like Mike and so many others who have come along with us. And finally, one thing that you have to remember is that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails. Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum, 1,600 different sites located across 6 different states, giving you opportunities to follow on various campaigns and follow generals, battles, leaders, you name it. Give a follow and a like over to Civil War Trails, and drop down in the description to see how you might be able to help out Civil War Trails. And if you're out there on the trail, be sure to get a picture with one of those signs, hashtag sign selfie, and tag Civil War Trails to help them spread the word about their work. We will go ahead and take the rest of this commercial break, and we'll be right back with more Homebrew History. Look at that. And if you're watching on YouTube, you don't have to deal with the break. Isn't that great? We have more to talk about with Canada at War. Mike Bechthold. So, Mike, let's talk a little bit. We've kind of talked a little bit about Normandy, and one of the things that so often gets overlooked, and I'm very, very, very glad to see that more recent studies of the Normandy campaign have said, yeah, no, it wasn't just June 6th or even just 10 days. There's a 77-day battle, and really you could round that up to 90 and say that 90 days worth of fighting to finish this campaign. And then what happens, right? Because we're left with this kind of, all right, well, clearly you get to Normandy, and then from, again, the American perspective, there's Normandy. There's this little interruption called Market Garden, which is a little blip on the American radar, unless you're a sicko like someone here. And then all of a sudden, it's the Battle of the Bulge, and the war's over.
Yeah, I mean, the morale in the Allied armies at the end of the Normandy campaign couldn't have been higher. They had defeated the Germans quicker than they had expected. They had sent them running, fleeing back to Germany. They were running. They weren't standing except for small rear guards on the Seine River and other river lines as they flowed north back through France into Belgium and ultimately into the Netherlands and Germany. And from their perspective in the late summer of 1944, they couldn't be faulted for thinking the war might be over by Christmas, that they'd won this thing. They had defeated the Germans in Normandy and all was good. And so there was this period of the pursuit where the Germans were running back, the Allies were chasing them, and the Canadians were right in the middle of this. And probably one of the most remarkable things happened during this phase. On the 4th of September, the port of Antwerp was captured intact. And that was an absolutely huge accomplishment. Antwerp was one of, if not the largest port in Western Europe, an absolutely crucial cog in the logistical support that the Allied armies would need going forward. And here they had captured it 100% intact. The Germans had run away so quickly, and the Allies had the support of the Belgian White Brigade, that they hadn't had time to sink block ships in the channels. They hadn't blown up the docks or the cranes or anything else like that. Here was 100% working port. Problem was, and of course there's always an asterisk, it was at the end of a 50-mile long estuary in from the North Sea along the Scheldt River. And the Germans held both banks of that. What they would come to term as Fortress North Scheldt, which is Walcheren Island and the Beveland Peninsula, and Fortress South Scheldt, which became known as the Breskens Pocket. So they held it. The entire 15th German Army was trapped in there, anywhere between 80 and 100,000 men. And it was going to take some serious fighting to get out and get those troops out of there. So Montgomery handed that task to 1st Canadian Army. Now, first they had to complete the capture of the Channel ports, Boulogne and Calais, as well as Cap Gris-Nez, which is where some of those big cross-channel coastal gun batteries were. And then they were to turn their attention towards opening the Scheldt estuary and the port of Antwerp. Now, while all this was happening, Monty was focused on another little operation that was taking place, as you've alluded to, Operation Market Garden, which commenced in mid-September, and that was really the complete and utter focus of Montgomery during this period. Probably with good reason. I mean, it was the kind of operation that if it had succeeded, it may have shortened the war. It was a gamble. I know there's a lot of naysayers about the operation out there saying it was too bold a gamble. It was too much. They shouldn't have tried it. I think absolutely they should have tried it, because if it had succeeded, you never know how that would have impacted the war. And it came within a hair's width of being successful. As we know, 1st Airborne was stopped in Arnhem, that bridge too far. But then for the next month, British 2nd Army, 30 Corps, Americans who had landed at Nijmegen and what's the other bridge? Eindhoven, thank you. They were fighting in this salient that had developed, and just fighting tooth and nail to hold on. And sort of the background of this is, while that fighting's taking place in late September and into early October, that's when the Canadians are being tasked to open Antwerp. I would argue that the opening of Antwerp, once Market Garden had failed, was the absolute number one priority of the Allied armies in Northwest Europe. But Montgomery didn't see it that way. He didn't give the Canadians priority until almost mid-October, and it took a pretty big prodding from Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who was the senior British naval commander in the theater, to say, hey, we need this port. The Canadians need more support. But until that happened, the Canadians were fighting really under strength against a German army that was really well supplied. Most of those 80,000 troops had escaped from the pocket by this point. They had gone across the Scheldt estuary from Breskens to Walcheren Island and then down the Beveland Isthmus and escaped from the pocket. And not a little point, they were then being fed basically as they escaped into the Market Garden battle and attacks against the salient. But there was two very strong divisions that were left, one in each of the two fortresses. and they were very well supplied. They had all of the weapons, lots of 20 millimeter and 40 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, and more ammunition than they could ever use, because it was all being left behind by the escaping troops. And they had to defend, and they were given a kith and kin rule by Hitler and the German commander Eberding, saying, you shall not surrender, you shall not retreat. If you do, we will take it out on your family back home in Germany. And so that's a pretty big motivating factor to keep the troops fighting at a point when maybe they are ready to not do so. But it took a month of hard fighting. The Canadian battles started, in the Scheldt, Breskin's Pocket, on the 6th of October, with a real daring attack across the Leopold Canal. And then that was followed up with an amphibious landing in the rear of the pocket on the 9th of October. All the while, and this is 3rd Division, while 2nd Division is advancing up north of Antwerp, through some nasty battles in Wansdrecht, and then ultimately up the Beveland Isthmus and towards Walcheren. And it took them the better part of a month to get this done. And I would argue that the Canadian campaign in the Scheldt is possibly our most important fight of the entire Second World War, because it was dominantly a Canadian operation. Of course, there was RAF support, a lot of RAF support, and British units were brought in for the ultimate capture of Walcheren Island, especially.
John McManus would tell you that there's Americans involved too.
The Americans came in a little bit later. The 104th Timberland Division came in and helped. This was once Montgomery took the handcuffs off the Canadian and started giving them the resources they needed. 104th was fed into the battle, and also fought north of Antwerp, towards Bergen-op-Zoom and farther north that way, under Canadian command during this battle.
Bo, I know we talked with John about the Scheldt. Do you remember that was kind of like I guess a postscript to our Market Garden conversation. Our Market Garden series, which you can check out. Its own little playlist right here on YouTube. But one of the things that we talked about there is that really the Scheldt and the port at Antwerp signify what the war really, how you win and lose a war. Right? If you're not focused on supply, and you're not focused on getting your troops food and ammunition and the things that they need to stay in the fight, by securing a port like Antwerp and then capitalizing on its availability to feed these advanced armies. I mean, when we go back to Market Garden, whole reason for trying to hurry up and end the war, and whole reason for making this big, deep plunge, is to try and relax the supply lines, which are, you're still running in stuff from the beaches in Normandy across France, through Belgium, and into Holland. This solves all of your problems. And it's amazing to me that a soldier's general like Montgomery couldn't see that. Now, look at that. I did it. I criticized the great man. You're welcome. Dear listener, I can be
when it's needed.
I can still wear the historian hat.
See, I think I'm well placed between the two of you here, because I think Montgomery was a great general with some pretty substantial flaws, and he got more right than he got wrong, but he certainly didn't make every decision in the right direction.
Bo just likes to be the contrarian to me. That's all it is. That's
part of my job. It's in the friendship agreement that we signed at Port Hudson that one time.
Yeah.
Well, it wouldn't be fun if everybody agreed all the time, would it?
Exactly. I tell my students that all the time. I'm like, okay, we understand the basics. We know, right? We know that D-Day happened on June 6, 1944. But when you start getting into the weeds of it all, that's where the fun starts. And they don't, granted, these are, freshmen, sophomore, students, and depending on what semester it is, I can sometimes get my juniors and seniors into a higher level course. So they're a little bit different, but for my intro level students, let's be honest, they really don't give a shit about what I'm talking about anyway. But I try to get them involved.
I don't.
Well, you do, because you have to, and you love me, or at least I think
said so. I don't.
Yeah. Well, that's not what Tequila would say.
See, that's one of my pet peeves. It's like people talk about revisionist history as if it's a slur, And my feeling is, if you're not revising history, what the hell are you doing? I mean,
Exactly.
if you've got nothing new to say, if you've got nothing new to add, if you're not able to revise the story we've already heard, then you may as well, I don't know, go be a plumber or something else. Get a history game.
It's like, at one point in time, we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. So I guess it's, revisionist science to say that we're not. Like, no. Come on. Well, Mike, we had talked about the 12th SS, and there was a little bit of boohickey behind some of that. So,
you're moving right to boohickey history. No one's
right.
All right.
So, Mike,
I got to be better at keeping up.
Yeah, that's right. So, boohickey is something that is just absolutely rubbish. Something that is just completely, surrounded in mythos. What is something that you want to dispel now?
12th SS is not a fucking elite division.
What the listener can't see is that I've thrown my hands up and I am shouting for joy.
Wow. 12th SS was a competent division at times and a absolutely terrible division at other times.
Yep.
I think they were well equipped. They had the best equipment. They had the best tanks. They had the sexy black uniforms. And I think people fixate on that far too often.
Mm-hmm.
Their commanders were a mixed bag. Some were very good. Many were not. The same with their troops. And I think the one thing that often doesn't get looked at with 12th SS is that attacking in Normandy was very difficult. Defending was relatively easy. And anytime anybody was attacking, they had a lot of trouble doing it. The Canadians were very good at attacking, sort of a bite and hold approach. Lots of artillery, limited objectives, drench the zone, go in, take it, bring your forces up and do it. The Germans never understood that. The Germans, as Meyer himself said, thought we were just Russians in a different uniform, and that all you had to do was to blast some artillery, run your panzers in, and they would go running away, like I guess his experience with the Russians were. And that wasn't the Canadian experience. And during those battles from the 7th to the 10th, the Germans found out the hard way that the Canadians were very good soldiers who did things the right way. They used their artillery. If they got surrounded by tanks, they knew that tanks couldn't do much to infantry up close, so they just went to ground, brought up the Piat, used the Piat and took out the tanks, or even used sticky bombs. There we go.
It is.
In Market Garden, bridge too far. They would go and take sticky bombs and put them physically on the side of the tank to take them out. And the Germans lost a lot of tanks during their attacks on Bretteville-Norrie and Puteaux. One of my favorite stories has to do with a single Canadian Sherman tank, a Firefly, that took out 5 Panthers in a matter of minutes. When the Germans tried to launch an armored attack on Norrie-en-Besson, and they went streaming across the field, and a Canadian, 4 Canadian Shermans happened to be in exactly the right place, and in a matter of minutes, basically one Sherman Firefly destroyed 5 Panthers as fast as they could reload the gun, and another 1 or 2 Panthers were destroyed by the other tanks, and that German counterattack was absolutely destroyed. And Germans had no idea what was going on. At first, they thought they'd just run over landmines, and it wasn't until later they figured out what had actually happened. So the Canadians were really good soldiers, and I would say that if you had to put an average German soldier against an average Canadian soldier, it wasn't even close. The Canadians were better soldiers. They were better trained. They were better motivated. They were better led, and they were just much better. So my boohickey is SS were not elite.
You mean that chocolate wasn't the right way to go?
So much for the man for man thing.
Yeah.
Now, there was another little bit of boohickey we had talked about back in the very beginning before we even hit record. And I think that has to do a little bit with where Canada sits in the memory and the legacy of the war. And we've kind of talked about it a little bit in that from an American perspective, it's the Americans. Occasionally you'll find somebody that says, oh, it's the Americans and the British. There's a really, really big group of people, and I can't understand this one with the obsession with the Russians and the Soviets. I'm sorry, I can't do that. It's the lover of Western democracy. I can't do that. And then there's the Canadians, and it seems when you look at the anniversary footage, like we talked about, we have these conversations about current events, current world events. Canada gets left out of the picture, and you get talking heads and politicians that say things like, well, America had to foot the bill, and America did this, and America did that, forgetting the fact that
who would say that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Oost.
I don't know who could have said anything like that. But for 6 years, we've got British, Canadian, French, Belgian, Polish, American, allied Western powers throwing themselves against the German army to defeat this evil monster. And then today to not get any recognition for it.
I've got two thoughts on that. The first is that Canada was a middle power in the Second World War. There's no way to say that. We weren't one of the big boys, but it is fair to say that we punched well above our weight during the war. I mean, a little over 1 million people and 11 million people and 1 million people in uniform. Canada did its part and then some. We had an important role to play in the war. If I had to say, I said the Scheldt campaign was our most important campaign. I would say the British Commonwealth Air Training Program, which took place in Canada, where we trained British Empire pilots, aircrew, bombardiers, navigators during the war, was probably our most important contribution during the war. Some 130,000 airmen were trained during the course of the war, and were absolutely crucial in feeding the Allied Air Forces, Bomber Command and Fighter Command and Second Tactical Air Force and everything like that. And that doesn't even get into the role that Canadian industry played during the war. Everything the Americans built, almost everything, Canadian factories were building. We built some 400, the equivalent of a Liberty ship, hundreds of thousands of trucks, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. The Helldiver, the Curtiss Helldiver used by the U.S. Navy, nearly 1,000 of those were built in Canada for the U.S. Navy. Like the economic input of Canada was absolutely crucial, as were the raw materials we had, iron, oil, aluminum, farm products, you name it. We were providing those to the Allies, lend-lease to the Soviets, stuff like that. Absolutely essential to the overall Allied war effort, and very little of that gets talked about.
It's a lot easier to train your pilots when you don't have Messerschmitts flying, around.
Oh, absolutely. We had the space, but I mean, we went from having a very limited air industry in Canada in 1939 to having dozens of airfields, hundreds of schools built up right from coast to coast, especially in the prairies where it was just wide open, flat land, ideal for training pilots. But it was an absolutely crucial contribution. And then I guess the other point, and maybe this is a good way to close it, you mentioned Tim Cook earlier. Tim is one of our great Canadian historians right now. He's the chief historian at the Canadian War Museum up in Ottawa, a good friend of mine. And he's just written a book called The Good Allies. Yep. And I don't know if we could have a more timely book, but it looks at Canadian and U.S. relations during the Second World War and how close they were. He looks at it on the home front, relations between our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, and your President, FDR. He looks at it on industrial cooperation. He looks on it on economic cooperation. He looks at it on battlefield cooperation. And he's not telling just a positive story. There were certainly ups and downs during the war. But for two sovereign nations, I'm not sure there's any example of two sovereign nations working better together and more closely together for the prosecution of the Second World War than happened between Canada and the U.S. during the Second World War. And it's an absolutely amazing story, and I highly recommend his book to all of your people. And I think Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to end that. If you got any more questions.
We actually don't have, I don't have any more questions. Bo, do you have any more questions? But we do have a member question. And this one comes from our dear friend, and I think mutual friend, Norma Graham. And it's actually Norma who inspired a lot of the discussions that we've had here. You know, her constant kind of prodding at the, you know, at us, what about Canada? What about Canada? What about Canada? And so all the love in the world to Norma. Her question for you, Mike, is what does Mike think was so special or extraordinary about Canadians in the war?
Well, thanks very much for the question. Thanks, Norma. I'm a big fan of Norma. Norma is a librarian. I'm not sure that she's retired yet, but in semi-retirement, and she's just decided to go back to school to do her master's in history. So really keen and eager to learn, and everything I respect about that. Norma, that's a great question. I think a lot of what I've been talking about already today addresses that question. But I think the biggest thing is the fact that the vast majority of Canadians were volunteers. I mean, here is this war that is taking place overseas, is not an immediate threat to Canada. There's no chance that the war is going to come to Canada in the near term. I don't think there's any chance that we were ever going to be conquered or taken over by the Germans or the Japanese, even despite the fears that were revealed in the press at the time. Canada could have safely sat out the war and been none the worse for it. But we didn't. We jumped into the war right from almost day one. And the vast majority of Canadians who fought overseas, whether it be in Europe or in Africa or the Pacific, were volunteers. That these were men and women who gave up everything in their lives, left their families, left their jobs, went into a situation where they didn't know if they were even going to come home, because it was the right thing to do, because Western society was being challenged. Most didn't know about the Jews at the time, but it was clear that bad things were happening in Germany, and bad things would continue to happen if the Germans weren't stopped, if the Japanese weren't stopped. So Canadians answered the call. They volunteered in large numbers to go and get the job done, as distasteful as it might be.
I always make the joke, you know, it sure as hell beats my 9 to 5. You know, I might as well go across the pond and whoop some Nazi ass, you know. And I always make the joke. I said, you know, my biological clock is ticking. My male urge to go volunteer somewhere and go die on a European battlefield, it's ticking. I'm getting older, you know. But no, I think you're incredibly right. Hit the hammer on the nail head there.
Well, you see the banner. You go ahead and do it. I've done enough.
Well, I have to ask our guest first, because it's just what we do politely. Mike, we have this segment on the show called What's in Your Cup? So we have to ask, what is in your cup?
You know what? This is probably the question I've most been looking forward to today. And I have a pint of Bo's Lug Tread, which is a local Canadian. I'm not quite sure I'd call it a microbrewery. It's a small brewery in Eastern Ontario, up between Ottawa and sort of halfway between Ottawa and Montreal. And this is a lagered ale, and it's one of my favorite pints, bar none right now. It's just a really delightful drink.
Well, by the way, my address is whenever you want to send that beer to me, I'll
put that in the show notes.
We'll put in the show notes. Yeah. Joey, what do you got, man?
As usual, I'll continue to let you down.
He's up the game a little bit this time.
I didn't want to feel like it was, I just brewed a cup of tea. So it was tea, but I muddled up some blueberries and some blackberries, and it's just a big mug of antioxidants.
While I'm on the other end of the spectrum, one's got tea, one's got beer, and I said, let me go to the hard stuff. As you probably learned in our past episode with Chaz Mena, my youngest brother Brady works at a place called Total Wine, which is an alcoholic's dream, except that alcoholics go to meetings and I have yet to go to one. But he brought, it's actually a gift for my wife, but It's called, and they had to bring it, to show, everybody too. It's called Elvis Midnight Snack, and it's a peanut butter, banana, and bacon flavored whiskey. I was so scared to try this because I'm like, I like all three of those things. I love peanut butter, I like bananas, and I like bacon. But sometimes when you squish all of those ingredients together, it doesn't always hit. It's kind of like fruitcake. Fruit's good, cake is great. Something in the middle, fruitcake is, kind of crap.
That's the second time this week you've used that.
It is, but it's true though, and it shows my disdain for fruitcake. Don't send me that. Send me beer instead. But you know what? This has a lot of banana flavoring in it. I'm not sure what to think about it, but I drank it all. What was in my cup, so it wasn't that bad.
Fair enough. Well, Mike, this has been great. And just so listeners and viewers know, where can they find some more resources? Where can they get in touch with you, and where can they follow along with your work?
Yeah, for sure. I'm mostly on Blue Sky now. It's Mike Bechthold at Blue Sky, whatever that stuff is. Posting there a fair bit. My big monograph is a history of Raymond Collishaw called Flying to Victory that's out. Mm-hmm. And later this fall, I've got an edited collection coming out from Naval Institute Press on air power in the Normandy campaign, which I'm quite looking forward to seeing the light of day.
Awesome. And I think I can speak for Bo. We're looking forward to seeing that too. Bo, always a pleasure. Mike, thanks so much for coming on. And for all of you sitting at home, listening and watching, we'll catch you next time.
Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, guys.